So yeah, once again, Matteo, thank you for accepting the invitation, and I'll introduce you. We'll have today in the Zenith Seminar Matteo Cantarelli from the company MetaCell, and Matteo is going to talk to us about software development in neuroscience. So thanks so much, Matteo. And I think, as Matteo said, let's try to make this interactive. So I think if you have questions during the talk, go ahead and speak.
Yeah, sure. Interrupt me at any point in time. And thank you for the invitation. By the way, when I accepted it, I didn't know I was going to be moving from a country to another. So right now I'm in a hotel room. I hope the connection would be good enough. And do let me know if it is not the case. I can kill the video, but I will try to keep it on if you guys can hear me. But yes, I wasn't planning to be in a hotel, but that's where I am now. I'm in Italy. And so I wanted to start maybe with a few minutes on my background, since it's probably different from most of the backgrounds with a more traditional academic track that you guys have seen, which could be interesting and useful, as in, okay, something else could happen with my life. And of course, it's great to stay in academia, become the best PI ever, but that is not what happened to me. As a matter of fact, I left academia fairly early. I was offered a PhD, so I was in engineering, electrical engineering. And after that, I've done, which was in Italy, did a bachelor and master in Italy, electrical engineering. Then I went to France for an engineering master in, it was more like mechanical engineering, systems engineering, distributed system. And I was offered a PhD in something that was more like automation. And I was not interested. And I said no. So sometimes it's fine to say no. And instead, at the time, I decided to move to Ireland to work in a software company. I didn't speak English at the time. I did speak French because that's where I was doing the master's. And I wanted, okay, I enjoyed writing software. So I ended up going to Ireland because it was like not too far from Italy and English speaking. And you could pay with euros. So the sterling at that time scared me. And I did stay in Ireland for, I worked for this software company. It was a German company building fairly cool software for the automation industry, but I was working more on the compiler team. So I got to learn about working with languages low level, compiling languages from one language to another, which was fairly cool. And it was at that time that I started, as many people are curious about many things, I started being curious about, biology in general and the brain. Everybody, you're in your 20s. Okay, how does our brain work? And it was fairly material in a sense, until I, through the internet mainly, got in touch with some other folks with similar interests. And 2011, I co-founded what then became the OpenWorm Foundation. OpenWorm being this international project that got featured a fair bit in the press around 2014-15, with the goal of building a full-scale model of the C. elegans. Very ambitious goal. Did not manage to do that just yet, but it was enough to kind of put me in touch with a network of like-minded people with similar interests. Eventually, I relocated to London, where I joined a neuroscience lab in UCL, the lab of Angus Silver, and there it was kind of my dream job on paper at the time, because I was sort of working with the skills that I knew, like software engineering, and applying them to a domain that I cared about, which was neuroscience. So it was like, okay, here I will get to learn more about the neuroscience, but to do it in a way that I can actually contribute in some kind of a way. And after a few years at the lab, I quit that position, that dream position, and decided to start a company with another two partners. That company is MetaCell, and it is the company I still work for at present as the CTO. We grew the company from being just the three of us to being a company that now has like, I think the latest is 22 people. It's still a small company, but like larger than it was 10 years ago. And the idea of MetaCell was to essentially, being inside academia, one thing that became clear is that there was a kind of a gap in terms of how to write software, something that was often sort of delegated to PhD students. There's somebody that comes to the lab, but they know some programming language, they might know how to hack some Python together, they might know C, whatever language they fancy. But then, because writing software is not something that is really in the culture of a lab, as it shouldn't be, because it's not the main purpose. Main purpose is there is a scientific question that is being asked, and you try to get there. And so it is, in a sense, a bit underestimated what is required there, and we kind of identified a gap in terms of offering services to build software for research, software that needed to be invented because it wasn't there, because the question that was asked was a novel question. The data that was used was novel data that was not acquired before. And sometimes you just need to, have a vision and come up with something that isn't quite there just yet. So this is a little bit the path that I followed. I do have some slides to kind of show you some things, some of the things that we built. But again, now as I share my screen, you can already start asking questions. Again, let's keep this interactive.
Yeah, if you have any questions about Matteo's background or path, now is a good time.
Matteo, how easy was the transition from like writing code in a company to like writing code for a lab?
Very good question. And it was, I don't know if difficult is the right word, but it was certainly different. So in some aspects, I would say were easier, some were more difficult. One of the major difference was that in a company, you work in a team. So it's not, okay, it doesn't start and end with you. It starts with you and or with someone else, and there's like many other people that will be working with. There is people that write code just for the front end. There's people that write code just for the back end. There's people that don't write code at all, that are there just gathering requirements. There's people that create the architecture. There's people that test the code. There's people that work in Q&A. And you go to a lab and none of this exists. Like you learned to work within a structure, within team, with people specialized in the different functions, and then you just end up being by yourself. So on one hand, it's great because sky's the limit. You can do whatever you want. But on the other hand, it's like you don't have people to bounce ideas off. You end up being expected to being the expert about anything. Is it like visual design, UI, UX? Is it about some algorithms? Is it about like some machine learning? It's like you are the guy. So there is certainly this difference. In a company, you're not the guy. You are one guy or girl. That is, I think, the main difference.
Yeah. And would you say like for somebody who's like writing code in a lab, like it's like should we like have a knowledge of like multiple different languages, just so that like we can like bridge the gap, or like was it more comfortable for you to only like work with one language, and then things worked out with like other people, especially other researchers who were used to more scientific packages?
Yeah, to be honest, it depends what your personal goal is. From my perspective, I've always perceived a language as a tool that like I needed to use to do something. It's like not the end being science. So not something like to collect languages. Oh, and I also know X and I also know Y. By the way, at some point you kind of, the older you grow, the more things you start forgetting. So there's like right now, I wouldn't remember the syntax probably of any one language. So it's really something that at the beginning, it might be useful just to understand what the boundaries are, and the different types of languages that exist, of course. But if you're more interested from that perspective, otherwise, it's like you have a problem, and is your goal to solve that problem? Identify what is the best way to get there, and stick to that. It's like it's not necessarily to collect them like Pokemons or something. It's just like do what you need, use what you need.
Okay, I have more questions, but you can get on with the presentation. Like I'll ask them when appropriate. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. I probably enjoy those more than my own slides. That might be boring. Let's see. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, as a company, there's the slide that says what we do as a company. We have the goal of helping understanding the brain. And of course, we come from an angle that we think software can help. And we've definitely seen how software can help that, reaching some goals that would not be attainable without some sort of magic box that does some automation. We have seen different dimensions that software helps with. So there is the part about aggregating data together, because you run experiments, you're acquiring some data, but those data are always a part of the truth. And the truth is something that is augmented by looking also at other data, and also by looking at, okay, what were the boundaries and the parameters within which those data were acquired. Therefore, you need to also perform analysis, and visualizing the data is also something that ends up being useful. This data, of course, there's a lot of it, and needs to be managed at some point. So you need to, organize it in some way that it can be useful, because it's super easy to become overwhelmed otherwise by unstructured data, with the end goal of learning something, really. Extract insights. You have this data. The idea is that you put it together in some way that it lets you see in something that you could not see before. Let's help. Like the goal is to help your brain think about what is the reality you collected. In terms of customers, we started with academia. We still work a lot with academia. And that is on the right-hand side of this slide. These are some of the institutions that we work with on a regular basis. We've also expanded to foundations, non-profit, an institute, healthcare organization, and also pharma companies and the industry. The type of software that we build is still still pretty much fall within these macro categories, but of course with academia you end up being more cutting edge, or pursuing one specific scientific question, while with with a company there is sometimes more of a practical problem, like it's not as cutting edge, maybe a research side, but it's more you have different challenges software wise, which is, for instance, deal with a ton more data, having something that can work, or within a corporation. So in academia, you just need the software, and you don't care, because anyway, everybody that will use that software, is kind of within the control, within the lab. Like you work, for instance, for a corporation, and all of a sudden you need to have user roles, some people that can do some things, some people that can do some other things, and whatnot. So definitely different challenges, and also as far as we are concerned, also different price tags. Academia gets discounts, heavy discounts, almost at cost in terms of what we do. Here, it is just a slide, Shani, want to wake you up, just to show some of the what some of these interfaces might look like. I will not stay a lot in this slide, so as soon as you are fully awake, I will go to the next one, because anyway, we'll go one by one through some of the examples that I selected, just to give you again ideas of how is software used and what is the purpose that it is serving. So the first one that I'm showing you here is a virtual flight brain, something that now we've been building for several years, different iterations of the platform, funded by Wellcome, and used to be formerly Wellcome Trust in the UK, as with a consortium that involves the University of Edinburgh, the Molecular Research Lab at Cambridge, European Bioinformatics Institute. The idea with Virtual Flight Brain is that this consortium has been essentially serving as a hub for neuroimaging data for the Drosophila melanogaster. And as you know, one of the model organisms that are studied a lot in neuroscience. In this case, imagine you have, without any software, you end up having data, different type of data sitting literally in different folder that were sent to you by different groups. Once you build something like this, you have essentially the opportunity to integrate this data together. What is integrated here is that you can see at the top is microscopy data with a stack for the brain of the fly, integrated and synchronized with 3D reconstructions of each of the neuropils, the brain regions of the tiny brain of the fly. And you can see also as point clouds, we have data that is essentially showing gene expression patterns. And what makes Virtual Flight Brain fairly interesting is the fact that it's not just putting together the neuroimaging data, but also the ontology information. So there is a Neo4j ontology at the back end, and essentially every neuron, every region, every expression pattern is annotated with data that is putting these different things in relationships. And when you have an ontology like this, one of the things that usually you end up having are two interesting things. One is a parthonomy of the brain. So you end up knowing to what things belong. So you may have neurons that are part of this other region, which is part of this macro region, and so on. So you end up having a kind of containment relationship. And the other useful thing that you usually have when you annotate things with an ontology like this is the taxonomy. So you have the classification. What is the type of this thing that I'm looking at? Okay, this thing is this specific type of neuron, which then is a type of this other subclass of neurons. And essentially you end up having a taxonomy that you can follow, and that essentially also help you querying a database, because at some point you can start asking some questions with a tool like this one. Like, for instance, okay, I want to see all the neurons that have synapses in this particular region. And because you have annotated all of the data in this way, those are questions that can be answered. And I will not spend maybe more time here because there is several of these, but maybe if later there is more questions about something specific, we can go back and I can also try and give a live demo just to know how good my connection would be to start downloading tons of data. This is Neuroscan that we are building with Yale, with the lab of the Colin Ramos lab. In this case, a different model organism. Here we're talking about the C. elegans, and the question that the lab is investigating is essentially how cells and synapses evolve throughout the different stages of growth of the developmental growth of the tiny nematode, the C. elegans. And this is a platform that can be used to essentially filter on the left-hand side. You pick the developmental stage, and then you can query the system, and you can say, okay, show me all the neurons that exist at this point. Show me all the contacts, all the synapses that exist at this point. And then you can see how they evolve as with a timeline that you have in the tool. You can see how they evolve and see what is moving, what is growing, how it is growing. So once again, the idea is similar to the one in virtual fly brain in a sense, which is you have data and you are organizing it using a database. The moment you do this, then it is the moment that you can start asking questions to that database to pull out information that otherwise would not be so easy to get. This is something different yet similar. This is a project that we've been working on with Biogen, a pharma company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We presented a poster about this together with Biogen at the latest OCNS meeting, but it was a virtual one this year. The platform is fairly interesting. So what we are doing here with Biogen is we work with them with both publicly available data and data that the company had gathered throughout the years to essentially align in a common reference frame, and so using MNI coordinates in an anatomical space, multi-scale nodes for the human brain. So you can see at the top right that the concept is to have nodes that go from the molecular scale on the far right, all the way up to subcellular, cellular, subregion, organ level, and system level. So a node could exist at any of these scales, and then what is captured once again, still using a graph database's relationship between these different nodes. So we have once again parthonomy, we have once again taxonomy, but we also have information about anatomical pathways. So this region is connected to this other region. So there is this flow of data. And then the idea is to have essentially events that you can see here on the left-hand side, where events also have their own taxonomy. So an event can be something which is, a disease. It could just be a circuit, a motor circuit. And an event is decorating essentially available nodes and pathways that were made part of the system. And so you can do things like activating events and seeing, okay, if I'm activating, for instance, Alzheimer's disease, then you can see the various Braque stages, and you can see the various nodes lighting up depending on essentially the parameterization that is associated to that node for that particular stage. And with the same tool, you have on the one hand, as we were just seeing right now, an anatomical representation in 3D, but there is also the possibility to look at nodes in 2D. So this is a different way of exploring the data that can show you how the data clusters together. And in this case, for different nodes, depending on what they are, you have different information that is available. And I think this GIF that is looping right now, it is showing that for the red nucleus on the left hemisphere, there we have a heat map that is showing, for instance, the top 20 most expressed genes in the region according to what we have. In this case, the source of this data is one of the donors available publicly in the Atlas, the Allen Atlas. So another example of sheer amount of very diverse information that you can really start making sense and understanding once you do have some software like this. And this is something that we are still building. Actually, we are we'll be starting building these in the next month. And I will show you in one of the next slides something about the software development process, such that you can also appreciate what things happen to build things like this and in what order. But this is an application that we're building with the Golding Lab at the Salk Institute, who is building an atlas for the spinal cord of the mouse. And the idea is to, so we're not only working with them on the data science side of things, but also on building an interactive atlas that can then be used by anybody who has data that comes from experiments to register neurons against any of the available atlas. So the idea would be that people would be able to contribute new atlases and also to register data against any of the available atlases and do some design. You will see that this looks already built, same as this, but the difference is that this is actually built and this is a real software that you're looking at, while this is just interactive mockups, which you will learn in a second. It is one of the first things we create as you are defining what the software will be. I think this is one of the last ones. It might even be the last one, which is NetPine. So to show something which is more computational. So NetPine is something that we're building in collaboration with the lab of Salvador Dura Bernal at the State University of New York. And essentially NetPine originally comes as a Python library that can be used to create large-scale models. It essentially takes neuron and augments it by creating a declarative specification, that can be used to define networks, that can be used to define the rules in terms of like, okay, how are neurons in the various populations connected to one another? How are they positioned in space? And again, something that before could only be used programmatically, and now in collaboration with Salvador and the team, we also have the possibility to build through a user interface that of course makes things more visual and easier to use, especially is something that is meant to help students that are approaching what could in general be a difficult thing, but you never touched maybe a programming language, maybe you have never done anything computational, and the idea is that you have an interface, you can go there, you can start from a tutorial, and you can see how few cells are put together, and then how you can simulate them, how you can change parameters in one of the cells and see what impact that they would have as you're running the simulation. You're looking at checking traces. Okay, is my cell spiking? Is my cell not spiking? Oh, what is the calcium concentration? And it is something that just makes it more interactive. Certainly not removing the need for having programmatic access at some point, especially if you're building large-scale models. At some point, you might want to do something more advanced with a programming language, with Python or whatever. But this is something that is meant to help, getting there in a way that is not too hostile. So I think I have now a few slides in terms of how do you actually go about building any of this, really, because they look flashy, they look nice, they can be useful, but it turns out it's a fair bit of work in order to get there. And you start from on the left-hand side with what is called the requirements gathering phase. So you need to understand what the software needs to do. And this is something that in general, it is not clear. It is not clear to anybody. It's like there might be a problem that is clear. There might be some goal as written down in a grant. Those things tend to be more clear, but in general, then you have you need to get down to user stories. So what are user stories? User stories, for those of you who didn't come across this, are essentially a simple statements in English or whatever language that are specifying an atomic bit of functionality. So they are defining who the user is and what they are trying to do and why. So you could think now we're using Zoom, okay? And we all have a button, for instance, to mute ourselves, okay? How did this functionality come to exist? This functionality came to exist because fairly sure at some point, somebody wrote down a user story that has, as a meeting participant, I need to be able to mute my microphone. This is a user story. And the idea is that when you're doing requirements gathering, you write down sentences for each single thing that needs to happen through the software. As a meeting participant, I need to be able to, kill my cam. And that is something else that you write. So requirements gathering, you start writing all of these user stories that, depending on how the software is big, you can have hundreds of these, you can have thousands of these. Think of fancy advanced tools like 3D Studio Max, like Adobe Photoshop, there's thousands of user stories there, okay? And then there are what are called functional and non-functional requirements, which are augmenting the specification of the software. So something like in a Zoom call, there can be at least, it needs to support at least 40 participants together. Okay, that is a requirement. That is not a user story. That is something that is defining a specification for the engineers, such that when they are creating the software, if 30 users would make it crash, then it's not good enough because it is not satisfying this particular requirement. And while then you have things like non-functional requirements that are not about the specific functionality, but things that may indicate the performances. Okay, so when I'm joining the meeting, I need to be able to do so, within 1 second. I don't know, just making something up. Once you gather all the user stories, all the requirements, the functional and non-functional ones, then you want to start thinking about the user interface, usability. And at that point is when you start creating mockups. And you start in general with wireframes that are things that do not care too much about the aesthetics, but it's just like you're trying to organize the interface and understanding, in general, what various elements would be there. And then these wireframes evolve up until the point they become these fancy interactive mockups like the ones I was just showing you for SOC that are indistinguishable from aerial software. Then all of these user stories, what happens is you put them in a backlog. So in this case, I don't know how many of you are familiar with something that is called, the various agile methodologies like Scrum and whatnot. But the idea is that you have cards like in a traditional, say, Kanban board. And each one of these cards is something that is actionable, something that can be built. And so in your backlog, you create, for instance, one card per each user story. And then you need to estimate it. Okay, how many hours is it going to, or how many story points is it going to take to implement the functionality that can mute my microphone, as we were just saying? And maybe the answer is 5 story points, maybe the answer is 20 story points. And then you have these, on the right-hand side, the idea here, and there's an arrow because this is really iterative. So you have these sprint meetings during which you go through the backlog, you see what are the things that you want to prioritize, and then you decide that in this sprint, for instance, we're going to work on these cards that should take this amount of time. Then at that point, finally, for those of you that like writing code, it is only at this point that somebody's touching any code. Nobody wrote any code beforehand. And then you start implementing the various features, putting in place scaffolding, and so on. Other things that you need to do is testing the software as it gets written. You deploy it, which means you are essentially standing it up in whatever infrastructure you're using. Nowadays, we often talk about deploying on the cloud. So you have some provider, like it could be AWS, it could be Google Cloud Computing. You could have Azure, whatever it is. You take the code, it goes from being on a repository and it ends up being stood up in a server such that it can be accessed. You release that version and then you keep iterating. And the next version will have some new functionality, will have some bug fixed and whatnot. I just wanted to have a slide to sort of give an idea in terms of how you go about doing something like this. This one very simple slide is just to give you an idea, again, from a high level about how things are organized. One of the most classical thing that you could find in general is on the left-hand side. And this idea, these terms, I thought it might be useful just to give them to people that might not be familiar at all with software development. But the front end is essentially the part of the code that contains the user interface and all of those things that the user will be interacting with directly. Backend, you can think of that place where computation happens. And then the REST API, you can think of it what exposes the functionality implemented by the backend that becomes available from the front end. So if you have, something like Zoom again, the button and the icon to mute your microphone is something that would exist in the front end. Then in the REST API layer, you would have something that is saying, okay, I don't know why I'm architecting Zoom to the client to work through a server, but point being that you would have the interface that you need to call specified, and then whatever computation would need to happen would be exposed through the REST API. Now, in case of Zoom, it was a silly example because in this case, the software, as we're pressing mute, is not communicating to a backend, but it's all within client functionality, essentially. This is going to the operating system rather and saying eventually using whatever library is used, please mute the microphone. But the principle is exactly the same. On the right-hand side, just to maybe demystify some things that you might have heard, like microservices. Again, as you build applications and solutions that are more complex, then chances are you will not just have a single server which is performing all the functionalities. Imagine you have a pipeline. Imagine that you're doing some processing on some imaging. Let's say that you are acquiring some MRIs, okay? And then you need to do some patient MRIs that, let's say, you want to register against an atlas, okay? And let's say that you're deploying these into a hospital. And then when you want to do this, well, you can be sure that, if you need to be able to deal with hundreds of patients, there is not, a single machine that is computing the registration of these MRIs against these atlases. But you end up essentially doing a divide and conquer. You have architectures, so-called scalables, where that particular functionality is encapsulated by one atomic service that is called, for this reason, a microservice. So you can have a microservice with its REST API that is just saying, okay, I'm a microservice that offers the functionality to register an MRI against an atlas, and this is all I do. So I'm micro, I'm simple, my boundaries are defined very clearly. And then you have the ability to take advantage of something like Kubernetes, which is just one advanced piece of technology that lets us deal with scalability as it comes to computation in the cloud. Then you go to Kubernetes, and Kubernetes will spawn more computation. The more, you have 10 patients, you have 100 patients in parallel, then you will have different microservices that are essentially getting instantiated in some things that are called pods, and will do some type of computation that then gets, eventually returns to the front end. Something that is very important as we do all of this is to keep in mind that standards are our friends in general, usually. And this means that as you're building the software, if there is, the need to handle some particular data types or some particular information, you want to try as much as possible to do this using a standard that has been, established to take care of that particular thing. So there is one organization in neuroinformatics that I'm sure you guys will have already heard of. It's called INCF, and now they have really nowadays this mission of gathering standards, essentially different labs, different groups that are creating them, submit them to INCF that make sure that they are up to the task essentially of being standards for that particular thing. And if something like this exists, in general, it is a good idea to use. Of course, it is a field that is, evolving rapidly. So you always need to pay some attention to, it's easy to try and call something a standard, but it's not that easy for that something to really be a standard. And chances are some of these, might be a bit more premature than others. They will keep evolving. But point being is you want for the software to be as interoperable as possible with data that might be coming from different groups, and therefore the more you can rely on standards, the more you can reuse pieces of technology, the more you can use pieces of technology, the more your software is also something that can keep surviving the test of time. I'm glad this is the last slide. I definitely spoke more than I wanted to. And